The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, which on Epsilon Verd meant the sky had finally decided to commit to something other than its usual ambiguous drizzle. David Sterling sat in his clinic, watching water stream down the windows in thick rivulets, and wondered if he'd remembered to seal the supply shed properly. Probably not. He had a gift for forgetting the important things while remembering utterly useless information, like the fact that the coffee maker was exactly 47 steps from his bed, or that the third-floor panel in the bathroom buzzed at a frequency that made his teeth ache. The communication console beeped its lonely evening report. Another day, another log entry confirming that absolutely nothing had happened. David typed out his status update with the enthusiasm of a man describing paint drying in slow motion. Day 112, no medical emergencies. Treated survey team member for mild fungal infection, probably from not changing socks. Advised him to change socks. He seemed skeptical. Weather continues to be wet. Morale is wet, everything is wet. He hit send before he could second-guess the professionalism of his report. The colonial administration was 600 light-years away and had bigger problems than his deteriorating sense of humor. The sky lit up. Not lightning. David had seen plenty of lightning. This was different, a brilliant streak of amber and white tearing across the clouds like someone had dragged a knife through fabric. The sound followed seconds later, a rolling boom that rattled the windows and sent his carefully organized medical supplies dancing across the shelves. "Well," David said to the empty room, "that's not regulation." He pulled up the tracking interface, fingers moving across the holographic display with practiced efficiency. The system was old, probably older than he was, and had the charming habit of freezing whenever you actually needed it to work. Tonight it cooperated, showing him exactly what he'd suspected. An unidentified craft had just performed what the system euphemistically called an uncontrolled atmospheric entry, and what David would call crashing spectacularly into the valley. Protocol said to report it immediately. Protocol said to wait for the security team. Protocol said a lot of things that assumed you weren't the only medic within 200 kilometers of a potential crash site. David grabbed his emergency pack, the one with the good supplies he wasn't supposed to waste on anything less than a catastrophic emergency. He figured a burning ship counted. Probably. He'd apologize to the bureaucrats later, assuming he survived whatever he was about to walk into. The rain was absolutely vindictive. Within 30 seconds of leaving the clinic, David was soaked through, his jacket doing absolutely nothing to justify its existence. The path down to the valley was more mud than path at this point, and his boots made obscene squelching sounds with every step. Somewhere in the distance, he could see the orange glow of the crash site, a beacon of terrible decisions waiting to be made. It took him 20 minutes to reach the wreckage, and by the time he did, he was breathing hard and questioning every life choice that had led him to this moment. The ship was embedded in the hillside at an angle that physics probably had opinions about. It was sleek, built from materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, covered in symbols he didn't recognize. Definitely not human. Definitely not anything he'd seen in the colonial database, and he'd spent enough boring evenings scrolling through alien vessel classifications to recognize most of the common ones. Smoke poured from a rupture in the hull, acrid and sharp. David pulled his respirator up and approached carefully, scanning for radiation, biological hazards, or anything else that might kill him in interesting ways. The readings came back mostly clean, which was either reassuring or meant his scanner was broken. It was genuinely difficult to tell with colonial equipment. "Hello." His voice sounded ridiculous, swallowed by the rain and the hissing metal. "Anyone alive in there? I'm a medic, human, friendly, mostly harmless." No response. David found an opening in the hull, edges still glowing with heat, and squeezed through. The interior was a disaster, all twisted metal and sparking conduits. Emergency lighting flickered weakly, casting everything in shades of red and shadow. The cockpit was surprisingly small, designed for a single occupant, and that occupant was slumped against the controls, very still. David's training kicked in, pushing past the surreal horror of the situation. He moved quickly, checking for a pulse, for breathing, for any sign of life. The woman was alive, barely. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her skin pale beneath the grime and blood. She was humanoid, which was either a remarkable coincidence or said something interesting about parallel evolution. But her ears were wrong, elongated and tapered to elegant points, and when he checked her wounds, her blood ran silver-threaded through the red, catching the emergency lights like liquid mercury. "Okay," David said, more to himself than to her. "Okay, we can work with this, probably, maybe." He pulled out his medical scanner, and it promptly informed him that it had no baseline data for her species, and was making its best guess based on comparable physiology. Helpful. The readout showed internal bleeding, fractured ribs, possible spinal trauma, and a concerning list of other injuries that made David wonder how she was alive at all. He worked quickly, stabilizing what he could with the supplies he had. Coagulant foam for the bleeding, a rapid-set brace for her ribs, analgesics that he hoped wouldn't poison her alien metabolism. The whole time he kept talking, a steady stream of consciousness that was part procedure and part panic management. "You're doing great. Well, no, you're doing terribly, but relatively speaking, you're not dead yet, which is something. I'm going to move you now, and this is going to hurt, and I'm sorry about that, but staying in this wreck seems like a bad long-term plan." She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed closed, but her breathing steadied slightly as the medication took effect. David rigged a transport sling from emergency materials, carefully secured her, and began the agonizing process of getting them both out of the ship and back up the muddy path to his clinic. By the time he got her onto an examination table, his arms were screaming and his lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. The rain had somehow gotten worse, which seemed personally vindictive. David stripped off his soaked jacket, cranked up the clinic's heating, and got to work properly. Hours blurred together. He cleaned wounds, set bones, monitored vitals that fluctuated in ways that would have terrified him if he'd had the energy for terror. Her physiology was strange but not incomprehensible. Everything was where it should be, more or less, just slightly different, like someone had taken a human blueprint and made editorial changes. The sun was rising, weak light filtering through the rain clouds, when David finally allowed himself to stop. His patient was stable, breathing easily, her wounds cleaned and dressed. She lay still on the table, unconscious but alive, her strange ears the only obvious sign that she wasn't human. David collapsed into his chair, exhausted, and looked at the mysterious woman he'd just spent all night saving. He had so many questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why had she crashed? And more pressingly, what exactly was he supposed to do now? "Well," he said to the unconscious alien, "I hope you have a good explanation for all this when you wake up. Or at least an interesting one. I'll settle for interesting." She didn't answer. David hadn't really expected her to. He updated his log, noting simply medical emergency, non-human patient, status stable, and decided that explaining the rest could wait until he'd slept for approximately 1,000 years. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and in orbit high above, sensors began their search for something precious that had gone missing. David had discovered 3 things about his mysterious patient over the past 4 days. First, her wounds healed at a rate that made human medicine look like it had been designed by committee, which it probably had been. Second, she never slept, or at least he'd never caught her sleeping, which was deeply unsettling when he stumbled into the clinic at 3 in the morning and found her eyes open, tracking him in the darkness. Third, and most bizarrely, she refused to speak. Not couldn't speak. Refused. He was certain of it. "So I'm thinking," David said, changing the dressing on her shoulder wound, which had already closed to a thin silver line, "that you definitely understand me. You tense up when I mention needles. You track conversations. Yesterday, when I said I was going to check your spinal alignment, you shifted position before I even touched you. The woman stared at him with those unsettling amber eyes, expression absolutely neutral. Her elongated ears didn't even twitch. Strong, silent type. I respect that. I had a cat once with the same energy. Mr. Whiskers. He also judged me constantly. David pressed gently along her ribs, checking for any remaining fractures. Nothing. They'd been broken 4 days ago. You're healing impossibly fast, by the way. I'm either the best medic in colonial space, or your species has some seriously impressive biology. I'm going to assume the latter for the sake of my ego and medical accuracy. Still nothing, but he caught it just for a moment, the tiniest shift at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile, definitely aware. David sat back, pulling off his examination gloves. All right, here's the deal. I've reported the crash to Colonial Administration, which means eventually someone official is going to show up and ask questions I don't have answers to. It would be really helpful if you could, communicate. Blink once for yes, twice for no. Write something down, interpretive dance, I'm flexible. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under analysis. Then she reached out slowly and picked up the water glass from the side table. She drank, maintained eye contact the entire time, and set it down with deliberate precision. Was that a power move? That felt like a power move. David stood, running a hand through his hair. Fine. You want to be mysterious, but I'm going to keep talking because silence makes me nervous and I have a pathological need to fill empty space with words. It's a character flaw. I'm working on it. Not really, but I tell people I am. He moved to his desk, pulling up the research files he'd been compiling. The colonial database had almost nothing useful, just fragments and warnings. Her species wasn't in the standard index, which meant they were either incredibly isolated or incredibly good at staying off the radar. The ship design didn't match anything on record either, though the materials analysis had come back with some fascinating results. Metamorphic alloys that shouldn't exist, energy signatures that implied technology decades beyond colonial standard. Your ship is very impressive, by the way, David said, not looking up from his screen. Also completely unregistered, which is either illegal or means you're operating on a level where laws don't really apply. I'm hoping for the latter because the former gets me in trouble. Behind him, he heard the subtle shift of fabric. When he turned, the woman had moved to sit on the edge of the examination table, feet dangling, watching him work. She'd been bedbound 2 days ago. Now she moved like the injuries had never happened. You should probably still be resting, David said, though he knew it was pointless. But I'm guessing you don't take medical advice from anyone, let alone a human you could probably break in half without trying. Was that another almost smile? He was starting to recognize the micro-expressions, the tiny tells that suggested his patient found him amusing in the way one might find a small, harmless creature amusing. The days developed a rhythm. David would work through his normal duties, treating the handful of colonists who trickled in with minor complaints, while his mysterious patient observed everything with that same intense focus. He'd narrate his work, explaining procedures more out of habit than any expectation of response. He talked about the colony, about the weather, about how the coffee synthesizer had finally given up, and now everything tasted like sadness and burnt plastic. The secret, he said, showing her how he prepared the evening meal from ration packs, is to not think too hard about what you're eating. This is technically protein. From what source? The package says varied. I choose to interpret that optimistically. He caught her watching his hands as he worked, the careful, practiced movements of someone who'd learned to make do with limited resources. When he offered her a portion, she accepted it with a small nod, her first clear acknowledgement of communication. Progress, David announced. Tomorrow maybe we'll work up to actual words, or hand signals. I'll take hand signals. She ate slowly, and he noticed she mimicked his movements, The way he held the utensil, the pace of consumption. Learning, cataloging, understanding. It should have been creepy. Instead, it felt oddly companionable, like having a very attentive and mysterious roommate. That night, David woke to find her standing at the window, silhouetted against the perpetual rain. He should have been startled, but somehow he wasn't. He got up, joined her, two figures watching the darkness. "Can't sleep either," he asked quietly. "I get it. New place, recent trauma, mysterious human won't stop talking at you." She turned, and in the low light, her features were striking, alien and familiar all at once. She raised one hand, pressed it against the glass where rain streaked down the other side. David found himself doing the same, his hand opposite hers, separated by the barrier. It felt significant, though he couldn't articulate why. "I'm going to figure you out," he said, not in a creepy way. In a concerned, medical professional way. "There's a difference." Her lips moved, the first time he'd seen them form anything close to speech. No sound came out, but he could read the shape. "Good luck." David blinked. "Did you just?" But she'd already turned away, moving back to her bed with that impossible grace, leaving him standing alone at the window, questioning whether he'd actually seen it, or if sleep deprivation was finally catching up with him. The communication console beeped, startling them both. David checked it, frowning at the timestamp. 3 in the morning was not a normal time for official messages. The text was terse, formal, tinged with something that might have been nervousness. "Survey team arriving in 48 hours for incident assessment. Prepare full report on crash site and any recovered materials or individuals. Security protocols in effect." David read it twice, then looked at his patient, who had gone very still, her expression unreadable. "So," he said carefully, "I'm guessing you have opinions about security protocols. And maybe about being classified as recovered materials. Because I have opinions, and most of them involve that phrase being deeply offensive." She held his gaze for a long moment, and David had the distinct impression that decisions were being made, calculations running behind those amber eyes. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled, a real smile this time, small and sharp and somehow dangerous. And David realized, with the clarity of someone who just made a monumentally stupid decision, that he was absolutely not going to hand her over to colonial security without a very good reason. Possibly not even with a good reason. "This is going to get complicated, isn't it?" he asked. Her smile widened fractionally, and David took that as a definitive yes. Outside, the rain continued its endless fall, and somewhere in the vast darkness of space, an empire held its breath, waiting for news of their missing queen. The healing had become impossible to ignore. David stood in his clinic on the 6th morning, staring at scan results that made absolutely no sense according to everything he knew about biology, human or otherwise. The compound fracture in her left arm that should have taken months to heal had vanished completely. Not healed, vanished. The bone density readings showed no sign there'd ever been damage. "This is not how bones work," David said, turning the scanner around to show her the display. "This is how magic works. Are you magic? Is that what I'm dealing with here?" The woman sat on the examination table, now fully mobile, wearing clothes he'd scrounged from the colony's general supply. They fit poorly, too short in the arms, but she wore them with a dignity that suggested she was doing him a favor by accepting them at all. She looked at the scanner, then at him, and raised one elegant eyebrow. "Right, still not talking, got it." David set the scanner down with more force than necessary. "You know what's really frustrating? I'm a pretty good medic. Not great, but competent. And you're making me question my entire understanding of physiology. Do you know how unsettling that is?" She picked up his scanner, examined it with the same careful attention she gave everything, then tapped the screen 3 times. The display changed, showing a comparison analysis he hadn't known the device could run. It highlighted the differences between her cellular structure and baseline human, marked regeneration patterns that suggested accelerated healing was simply normal for her species. "Oh, so now you're helping," David muttered. "Could have mentioned you knew how to use the equipment days ago." The almost smile again. She was getting better at those, he noticed, or maybe just more comfortable showing them. A knock at the door interrupted them. David glanced at his patient, who'd gone perfectly still, body language shifting into something alert and potentially dangerous. He made a calming gesture, though he wasn't sure she needed calming so much as the person on the other side of that door might. "David, it's Reeves, got a minute?" Marcus Reeves was the closest thing the colony had to a chief of security, which meant he handled disputes about resource allocation and occasionally broke up fights at the recreation facility. He was generally reasonable, which David appreciated, though right now reasonable wasn't what he wanted to deal with. David opened the door partway. "Morning. What's up?" Reeves looked tired, the kind of tired that came from dealing with bureaucratic nonsense. "Can I come in? Need to talk about the crash." "Now's not a great time. Patient privacy, you know." "The patient from the crash." Reeves tried to peer past him. "David, we need to talk about her. I got another message from administration. They're very interested." "I bet they are." David didn't move from the doorway. "She's still recovering, not up for interviews." "It's been 6 days. Complex injuries take time." Reeves gave him a long look, the kind that suggested he knew he was being handled but wasn't sure what to do about it. "Administration thinks she might be military. The ship designed the materials. They're worried. She crashed in the middle of nowhere during a storm. If she's military, she's having a really bad week." "That's not funny." "Wasn't trying to be funny. I'm trying to treat a patient without turning her into a political incident." David softened his tone slightly. "Look, give me a few more days. Once she's stable, we can figure out the official stuff." Reeves ran a hand over his face. "They're sending someone from the security division. Should be here tomorrow, maybe sooner. Someone with actual authority and a very keen interest in unregistered alien vessels." "Tomorrow," David repeated. "Fantastic." After Reeves left, David closed the door and leaned against it. His patient was still sitting on the table, watching him with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been assessment. Possibly both. "So that's happening," David said. "Tomorrow you get to meet Colonial Security, who will have many questions I can't answer because someone refuses to communicate in anything resembling a normal way." She stood, moving to his desk where he'd left the research files open. She touched the screen, scrolling through the fragments of information he'd compiled about her species. When she reached the section marked Military Applications, Restricted Access, she paused. "Yeah, I maybe shouldn't have accessed those files," David admitted. "But you crashed in my backyard, so I figured I'd earned a little illegal research. The database doesn't know much, just warnings. Your people apparently fought a war about 70 years ago. Several wars, actually, won most of them. Then dropped off the galactic radar completely." She turned to look at him and something in her expression had shifted. Less guarded, maybe, or more calculating, hard to tell. "The reports call your species the Saravith," David continued. "But that's a human approximation. Bad translation from a trade language. The files say you have a rigid military hierarchy, advanced technology, and a tendency to value strength above pretty much everything else." He paused. "They also say you don't do diplomacy, which makes me wonder what you were doing out here alone." For the first time, she made a sound. Not words, but a soft exhalation that might have been amusement or exasperation. She moved to the window, looking out at the rain, and David had the sudden impression of someone very far from home. "I'm not going to let them take you," he heard himself say. "I mean, I probably can't actually stop them if they decide to. But I'm going to try really hard to be inconvenient about it." She turned and there was something different in her eyes now. A kind of recognition, maybe, or surprise. The console beeped again. David checked it, his stomach sinking as he read the update. "They're not waiting until tomorrow. Security transport is landing in 4 hours. They're bringing a full assessment team and a xenobiology specialist. He looked up. I think I accidentally made this a bigger deal by being protective. That's ironic and unfortunate. His patient crossed the room in 3 smooth strides, took the datapad from his hand, and for the first time she touched him deliberately. Her fingers were cool, precise, as she turned his hand over and pressed his palm against the datapad's biometric scanner. The device unlocked secondary functions, things he didn't even know existed. She typed rapidly, pulling up files buried deep in the colonial database. Military records, incident reports, things that should have been encrypted beyond his access level. She found what she was looking for and turned the screen so he could see. It was a grainy image, clearly taken from long-range surveillance. A ship like hers, but larger, leading a fleet of similar vessels. And highlighted in the tactical analysis, a single phrase in bold red text: avoid engagement at all costs. "Oh," David said quietly, "you're not just military, you're important military." She took the datapad back, wiped the access logs with a few quick commands and handed it to him. Then she did something he absolutely didn't expect. She spoke. David. His name, perfectly pronounced, in a voice that was lower than he'd imagined, with an accent that suggested language was something she'd learned with the same precision she applied to everything else. "Thank you." Before he could respond, before he could process the fact that she'd been capable of speech this entire time, she moved to the medical supply cabinet and began selecting items with clear purpose. Scanning equipment, emergency supplies, things you'd pack if you were planning to leave quickly. "Wait," David said. "You can't just go. You're still recovering, and there's a security team incoming, and I have approximately 1,000 questions, starting with why you could talk this whole time and chose not to." She paused, holding a medical kit, and looked at him with something that might have been regret. "Complications," she said, the word careful and deliberate. "If they find me, complications for you, for your colony. Better I leave." "Better for who? You can't even access your ship. The wreckage is probably under surveillance by now." David moved between her and the door, a gesture he immediately recognized as symbolic, since she could definitely get past him if she wanted. "And if you're as important as those files suggest, leaving might cause more complications than staying." She tilted her head, studying him. "You're protecting me. Why?" "Because you're my patient," David said simply. "And because I don't trust that security is interested in your well-being as much as they're interested in what you know and what your ship is made of. Call me cynical." Outside, the sound of engines cut through the rain. The transport was early. David and his patient both turned toward the window, watching lights descend through the clouds. "So," David said, "we can do this the official way, which probably ends badly for both of us. Or we can try something creative, which definitely ends badly but might be more interesting. I'm leaning toward option 2. She looked at him for a long moment, then handed him the medical kit. "Creative," she said, and there was definitely a smile this time. "Show me." The security team landed with the kind of precision that suggested they'd done this before. Multiple armored vehicles forming a perimeter around David's clinic, while officers in tactical gear established what they probably thought was a subtle surveillance position. David watched from the window, wondering if they realized how obvious they were being. "That's a lot of firepower for a medical interview," he said. His patient stood beside him, utterly calm, which somehow made everything worse. She changed back into her own clothes, salvaged from the wreckage, the dark fabric torn but still holding together in ways that suggested it was made from something far more advanced than standard textiles. Her ears, those distinctive elongated features, were impossible to hide. "They're scared," she said quietly, her voice still strange to hear after days of silence. "Fear makes people aggressive. Speaking from experience. Always." The knock came exactly 3 minutes later, punctual and authoritative. David opened the door to find 3 people, Reeves looking apologetic, a woman in colonial security uniform with commander insignia looking determined, and a man in civilian clothes carrying enough scanning equipment to stock a small laboratory looking fascinated. "David Sterling," the commander said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Commander Patricia Walsh, Colonial Security Division. We need to speak with your patient immediately." "She's right here," David said, stepping aside. "Though I should warn you, she's been through significant trauma and—" Walsh pushed past him, her hand resting on her sidearm in a way that was probably meant to be casual but came across as threatening. The xenobiology specialist followed, already running scanners, his eyes wide with academic excitement. "Saravith," Walsh said, not quite managing to keep the tension from her voice. "We don't get many of your kind out here. In fact, we don't get any. Your species doesn't do diplomatic visits." David's patient smiled, and it was nothing like the small, almost expression she'd shared with him. This was sharp, controlled, the kind of smile that made people remember why apex predators had teeth. "No," she agreed, "we don't." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Reeves shifted uncomfortably. The scientist's scanner beeped urgently, displaying readings that made him pale. Walsh's hand tightened on her weapon. "Your vessel was military grade. Weapons systems, advanced stealth technology, materials we can't even identify. You're not a civilian." "No. So what are you doing here? This is neutral space, no strategic value, nothing worth." Walsh stopped, processing something. "You weren't coming here. You were running from something." For the first time, David saw his patient hesitate. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was there. "The ship malfunctioned," she said carefully. "I crashed. Your medic saved my life, that's all." "That's not all," the scientist interjected, brandishing his scanner. "These readings are extraordinary. Your cellular regeneration rates, your neural density, the efficiency of your metabolic processes. You're not just Saravith, you're—" He consulted his display again, frowning. "I don't have a baseline for comparison, but these numbers suggest significant genetic optimization, military enhancement, command-level augmentation." The patient said nothing, but David saw her body language shift into something dangerous. Walsh caught it too. "We're going to need you to come with us for a full debriefing. Standard protocol for unidentified military personnel in colonial space." "She's not going anywhere," David said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "She's still my patient, and she hasn't committed any crime. Crashing doesn't count." "David," Reeves said quietly, "don't make this difficult." "I'm not making it difficult. I'm following medical ethics, which apparently everyone else has forgotten about." The scientist's scanner beeped again, more urgently. He stared at the display, then at David's patient, then back at the display. His face went through several interesting color changes. "Commander," he said, his voice suddenly very small, "I think we should leave." "What?" "These readings. I cross-referenced with the historical military database. There's only one individual in recorded Saravith history with this specific genetic signature." He swallowed hard. "We're not talking to a soldier. We're talking to Queen Saravale of the Void Fleets, commander of the Threkai campaign, the woman who ended the frontier wars single-handedly." The room went very quiet. Even the rain seemed to pause. Walsh's hand fell away from her weapon like it had suddenly become radioactive. "That's not possible. She's been missing for 2 weeks. There are entire armadas searching." She stopped, realization dawning. "Oh no." "Oh yes," David's patient said, and now her voice carried weight, authority that had been carefully hidden. "I am Saravale, and I crashed here because my ship was sabotaged by members of my own court who found the idea of peace negotiations inconvenient." David felt like he'd been punched. Peace negotiations. She turned to him, and her expression softened slightly. "I was traveling to a neutral station for preliminary talks with the Colonial Federation. There are factions in my empire who prefer perpetual war to compromise. They arranged an accident." She gestured at herself. "It was nearly successful. And you didn't say anything because if my location became known, those same factions would ensure I never reached any negotiating table." Alive or dead, my presence here would have created an interstellar incident. She looked at Walsh. Which is why you're going to report that you found no one, that the ship was empty, that I died in the crash. Walsh looked like she was having a small cardiac event. I can't falsify official reports. That's treason. It's survival, Saravale said calmly. Mine, yours, possibly your entire colony's. My disappearance has created a power vacuum. If the wrong people take control, they will resume hostilities with everyone, including your Federation. If I return now, damaged, weakened, I won't survive the political maneuvering long enough to matter. So what's your plan? David asked. Hide here forever, because I have to tell you my clinic is not equipped for long-term royal residency. She almost laughed. No, I need time to heal completely, to contact my loyalists discreetly, to arrange a return on my terms. A few weeks, perhaps a month. Absolutely not, Walsh said. We can't harbor a foreign monarch without authorization. The diplomatic ramifications alone are irrelevant compared to the military ramifications of refusing, Saravale interrupted. I'm asking for sanctuary, Commander. Temporary, discreet sanctuary. In return, when I reclaim my position, I will remember that the Colonial Federation extended courtesy when they had no obligation to do so. The scientist had gone from pale to enthusiastic. This is unprecedented. A chance to establish positive relations with the Saravith Empire, to study their biology with consent, to not die in a war we can't win, Reeves said quietly. That's what she's offering. Help her survive and maybe we all survive. Walsh looked at David. You knew who she was. I absolutely did not, David said honestly. I knew she was important, but Galaxy's most powerful warrior queen was not on my diagnostic checklist. We don't cover that in medical school. Yet you protected her anyway. She was injured. That's literally my job. Saravale stepped forward, addressing Walsh directly. Your medic saved my life when he had every reason not to. He asked nothing in return, expected nothing. He treated me with a compassion I haven't experienced in decades of ruling through strength and fear. She paused. I would very much like the opportunity to return that kindness, and to see if the philosophy behind it might be worth learning. David blinked. Are you saying I accidentally taught a warrior queen about compassion through my terrible jokes and worse coffee? Your coffee is genuinely awful, Saravale agreed. But yes. Walsh stood silent for a long moment, clearly running through scenarios, calculating risks. Finally, she sighed. 1 month. You stay here, low profile, no contact with your people until you're ready. We report the crash site as empty, salvage operations minimal. And when this is over, you remember who helped. I will remember everything, Saravale promised, and somehow that sounded more binding than any treaty. The security team left, taking their equipment and their panic with them. Reeves lingered at the door. David, you have the worst luck of anyone I've ever met. I prefer to think of it as exciting, David said. After they were gone, David and Saravale stood in the quiet clinic, rain pattering against the windows. She looked different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the weight of her identity was visible, no longer hidden. So, David said, Queen of the Void Fleets, that's quite a title. It's a burden, she corrected, one I've carried alone for a very long time. Not alone anymore, apparently. You've got a mediocre medic in a backwater colony who makes terrible coffee but excellent life-saving decisions. She smiled, the real smile, the one that wasn't sharp or calculated. David Sterling, when this is finished, when I return to my empire, I'm going to establish formal diplomatic relations with your Federation, and I'm going to request you as the colonial liaison. I'm not a diplomat. No, you're better. You're someone who sees people, not political assets. She touched his shoulder briefly, a gesture of genuine gratitude. Thank you for teaching me that such people still exist. Outside, the rain began to clear, and somewhere far above, in the vast darkness of space, loyal ships adjusted their search patterns, following coordinates sent from a source they didn't question, preparing for the return of their queen. But for now, in a small clinic on an unremarkable colony, a medic and a warrior sat together, drinking terrible coffee and discussing the strangeness of fate. And David thought that maybe, possibly, he just changed the course of galactic history. Or at least delayed a war. He'd take either.